October 14th, 1943, 0617 hours. Somewhere over the North Sea, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses are climbing through broken autumn cloud toward 25,000 feet. The target is Schweinfurt, specifically the ball-bearing factories that supply approximately 40% of the Wehrmacht's entire rolling bearing production. The mission planners at High Wycombe know this, the crews know this, and the German listening posts along the Dutch coast, triangulating the formations heading from its radio traffic, know this too. If you are a first lieutenant from Columbus or Baton Rouge or Spokane, sitting in the left seat of a B-17 with 18 combat missions behind you, you already know what this day will cost. You have been briefed. You know the gap in the escort coverage, the point, approximately 30 miles east of Aachen, where your P-47 Thunderbolts hit their fuel limit and turn for home, leaving your formation alone against whatever the Luftwaffe can put in the air. You have heard the estimates: several hundred German fighters, 6 hours of unescorted flight over defended Germany, and a Flak corridor over the Ruhr that will put steel in the air at a density your formation will have to fly through rather than around. What you also know, and this is the fact the German fighter pilots climbing toward you at this moment cannot process, cannot model, and frankly cannot believe, is the number at the end of your tour. Not a number of days, not a seniority ranking, a number of missions, 25. 25 combat missions, codified in U.S. Army Air Force's Regulation 3516, and you rotate out. Not to another theater, not to a training command in North Africa. Home. Back to the United States. Alive. This mission is number 19. Here is the sentence that explains everything that is about to happen to the Luftwaffe over the next 18 months. The Americans had decided that a pilot was not a weapon. He was a weapons system, and weapons systems, unlike individual warriors, can be rebuilt on an assembly line. Part 1. The Weight of Every Name. By the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe had been at war for 4 years and 2 months, and in that time it had built what was, by any professional military metric, a superb fighting force. The Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings organized under Luftflotten across every active theater, were staffed by officers who had accumulated combat experience no other air force on Earth could match. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf W-190A8, were technically competitive with anything flying under any flag. Their tactics, built around the Ratti and Schwarm formations first developed during the Spanish Civil War, were so effective that the Royal Air Force had reverse-engineered and adopted them. Their doctrine was codified in the Luftwaffe Dienstvorschrift 16, the service regulation governing aircrew employment, and its central premise had been validated by 4 years of consistent battlefield success. That premise was this: the fighter pilot is not a position. He is a skill accumulation that takes years to produce and cannot be approximated by volume. You do not replace a good pilot, you protect him. This philosophy produced genuinely extraordinary results. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had inactive frontline servicemen like General Major Adolf Galland, commanding all German fighter forces from his headquarters in Berlin, with 104 confirmed aerial victories and a Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds at his throat. On the Eastern Front, a young Oberleutnant named Erich Hartmann was assembling the aerial record that would make him, by the end of the war, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in the history of combat aviation. 352 confirmed victories across 825 combat missions. These men were not outliers produced by luck. They were the product of a system that selected rigorously, trained intensively, and then kept its best men in the fight indefinitely, because the system had no mechanism for removing them. Here is what that relentless exposure cost. In 1939, the standard Luftwaffe fighter pilot training program required 210 flying hours before a man reached a front-line unit. By the autumn of 1942, Luftwaffe Training Command had been forced to cut that figure to 160 hours, not because the syllabus was wasteful, but because Germany was rationing aviation fuel. The cutback was the first structural crack in a foundation that had been laid on the assumption of abundance. By the spring of 1944, replacement pilots were arriving at operational Jagdgeschwader with as few as 100 total flying hours, of which perhaps 30 had been logged in a combat-capable aircraft. Their American counterparts, on that same morning, were landing in England with 400 hours of documented flying time. The deeper constraint, though, was not the training hours. It was what happened after training ended. There was no tour. There was no endpoint. In the Luftwaffe, a man flew until one of four things ended his service. He was killed, he was captured, his body was destroyed by wounds or cumulative exhaustion, or the war itself concluded. There was no 25th mission. There was no 30th. There was no number at all, because the Luftwaffe's doctrine did not operate on the concept of a finite commitment. It operated on the concept of the indispensable man. If you were exceptional, you flew more. If you survived, you flew more still. The system treated its best pilots as its most essential assets, and, in doing so, made them its most unsustainable liability. Hans Ulrich Rudel flew 2,530 combat sorties on the Eastern Front before the war's final week. Erich Hartmann flew 825. These numbers do not represent heroism alone. They represent a system that had no other answer to loss. No pipeline, no rotation, no reserve, than to demand more from the men it had not yet lost. Adolf Galland understood this with the clarity of a man who had been watching the arithmetic compound against him for years. In his 1953 memoir, The First and the Last, he wrote with the precision of a man making a confession, "We had no reserves, no trained reserves, no pool of experienced men from which to draw when the losses came. The entire burden fell on those who had survived the previous battle." The Luftwaffe's replacement system, such as it was, required pulling partially trained pilots from flight schools and delivering them to frontline units whose commanding officers would spend the first 3 missions simply trying to keep them alive long enough to be useful. Between July 1943 and January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 2,300 fighter pilots killed or captured. Its training system was producing roughly 900 replacement pilots per quarter. The deficit was not a crisis awaiting correction. It was a structural condition that would compound with every mission until there were no more pilots to lose. And the loss rate, from Black Thursday onward, had a particular cruelty to it. The Luftwaffe expended not just aircraft but something far harder to replace: the accumulated experience of pilots who had been flying since the Spanish Civil War, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain. Pilots whose institutional knowledge of tactical formation, of aircraft handling at the edge of the envelope, of the specific behavioral signatures of different American bomber groups, could not be written into any training manual and transmitted to a 20-year-old with 100 hours in his logbook. Every time an expert died or was captured, the Geschwader's collective knowledge contracted slightly, and the next mission became fractionally harder for every surviving pilot. This is what exponential attrition looks like from the inside. It is not a catastrophe. It is a slow, professional deterioration, mission by mission, so gradual that no single day feels decisive, until the day comes when the pilots crossing into enemy airspace have never been in combat before, and everyone who had been is dead. Germany trained approximately 55,000 military pilots between 1939 and 1945. Total. Across 6 years of global war on 2 continents. That number, 55,000 over 6 years, represents the entire productive output of the Luftwaffe's pilot training establishment. The United States Army Air Forces trained 193,440 pilots over roughly the same period, not including navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and the other 8 specialist positions that filled out a heavy bomber's crew. Pilots alone, 193,440. These numbers represent the entire philosophical divide made concrete. The Luftwaffe was building artisans. The Americans were building a workforce. Artisans produce masterpieces. Workforces produce wars. What the Luftwaffe's doctrine could not conceive of was the existence of an enemy that had designed its entire air war around the assumption that pilots would be lost, and had built an industrial machine specifically to replace them faster than they could be killed. Part 2. The factory behind the cockpit. Here is the core idea, and it is so simple that it required the combined industrial output of the continental United States to believe in it. A pilot is a manufactured product, not a warrior forged by heredity and destiny. A manufactured product, produced through a defined sequence of inputs, time, fuel, aircraft, instructors, standardized curriculum, and delivered at the end of that sequence in a condition that was not extraordinary, but was reliably adequate. The Americans had made a deliberate, formal, institutional decision that adequate pilots, produced in sufficient volume, were more strategically lethal than exceptional pilots produced in quantities that scarcity would always limit. The official architecture of this decision was the Arnold Expansion Program, named for General Henry Hap Arnold, Commanding General of the Army Air Forces, who submitted to the War Department in 1939, while the first summer of the European War was still warm, a proposal to train 30,000 pilots per year. The War Department's initial response was that the number was not credible. Infrastructure of that scale did not exist. Arnold replied that the infrastructure would be built. He was told this would take years. Arnold said they had better start immediately. By 1942, the Army Air Forces Training Command was operating from 600 separate installations across 48 states. Primary flight schools in Georgia, Texas, and California. Basic flight training fields in Mississippi and Kansas. Advanced flying schools divided between single-engine and twin-engine tracks. Gunnery schools in Nevada. Bombardier schools in New Mexico. Navigation schools in Texas. And at the end of the pipeline, operational training units where assembled crews flew their actual combat aircraft together for 3 months before crossing the Atlantic. Walk through what this system produced, specifically. A man enlists in Chicago in January 1943. He spends 9 weeks in pre-flight school. No aircraft, just navigation theory, Morse code, meteorology, aircraft recognition, and physical conditioning designed to sort the people who freeze from the people who function. If he passes classification, he enters primary flight training at a contract civilian school, perhaps Dar Aerotech in Albany, Georgia, or Cal Aero Academy in Ontario, California, where a civilian instructor puts him through 60 hours in a Boeing Stearman PT-17 biplane over red Georgia clay. From there, basic flight training at an Army field, flying a Vultee BT-13 Valiant for another 70 hours, learning instruments and formation flying. Then, advanced training, 75 more hours, in either a North American at 6 Texan or a twin-engine Beechcraft at 10 Wichita, depending on where he has been assigned. He receives his wings approximately 12 months after enlistment. He then reports to an operational training unit, where he meets 9 other men: co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, 5 gunners, and spends the next 3 months learning to fly a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress as a unit, in the specific aircraft he will take to war. He arrives in England in the autumn of 1943 with 400 flying hours. He has eaten dinner with his crew 90 times. He knows which gunner snores and which navigator prays before takeoff. He has a functioning team. By 1943, this pipeline was delivering approximately 10,000 new pilots per month. Every month, without interruption. And then there was the promise waiting at the end of it: 25 combat missions, and you go home. This promise, formal, documented, and enforced by policy, was not a morale measure grafted onto a training system. It was a production decision made by men who understood that a pilot with a guaranteed endpoint would fight differently than a pilot with none. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the B-17 Memphis Belle, one of the first crews in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions, in May 1943, described the psychology of the tour with an engineer's precision. You counted every mission. You counted them the way a man serving a sentence counts days. And knowing the number, having the number fixed and real, kept you functional in a way that no amount of patriotism alone could sustain. On May 17, 1943, Morgan and his crew completed their 25th mission and rotated out to the United States for a war bond tour. The Memphis Belle did not stop flying. A new crew took her. The ground crew that had maintained her for 10 months was still at Bassingbourn. The mission continued. Andy Rooney, then a young reporter for Stars and Stripes, who would cover the 8th Air Force throughout the campaign and later describe it in his 1995 memoir, My War, observed this rotation system with the dispassion of a man watching a factory floor. The remarkable thing, he wrote, was not the courage. Every Air Force had courage. The remarkable thing was the continuity. Units that lost half their aircraft on Thursday were flying again on Monday, and you could not tell from watching them that Thursday had happened. The continuity Rooney identified was not natural resilience. It was the product of a design system executing its design function. This is the detail that German intelligence, reading prisoner interrogation reports in Berlin, could not assimilate. The Americans were not simply replacing aircraft. They were replacing crews, and replacing them not from a fixed pool of available men slowly being depleted, but from a pipeline that had been designed, funded, and constructed specifically to run faster than combat could drain it. The Luftwaffe was measuring air power in aces. The Americans were measuring it in sorties per day. Those are not the same measurement. They do not even occupy the same conceptual framework. Part 3. The system that caught the falling men. The training pipeline and the tour rotation were the visible architecture of the American advantage. What German intelligence never fully penetrated, what remained essentially a structural mystery until post-war analysis, was the parallel system the Americans had constructed to ensure that the men who were shot down, damaged, or psychologically broken did not become permanent losses. The official designation for the first element of this system was the Army Air Force's Convalescent Training Program, established in 1943 by direct order of General Arnold after the Surgeon General's office began documenting an alarming pattern. Combat aircrew, who were diagnosed with what the Army called operational exhaustion, and what the crews themselves called, with the gallows brevity of men who had lived inside it, going flak happy, were deteriorating rapidly if not treated, and were dying on their next missions when returned to duty without treatment. The program Arnold ordered was built around a specific operational insight. A damaged pilot who could be repaired within 2 weeks was worth far more than a permanent medical discharge or a preventable combat death. The recovery facilities were called conversion training establishments in official correspondence. They were called Flak houses by everyone who used them. There were 12 of them by the end of 1943, located in requisitioned English country houses spread across 6 counties. Coombe House near Salisbury in Wiltshire, Stanbridge Earls in Hampshire, Eynsham Hall in Oxfordshire, 9 others, each within a few hours' drive of the 8th Air Force's bomber bases in East Anglia and Lincolnshire. Each facility held between 50 and 150 officers at a time. Total throughput by 1944, approximately 6,000 aircrew per year, rotating through stays of 1 or 2 weeks. What happened inside a flak house was, by the standards of any military organization in any war in recorded history, extraordinary. Officers wore civilian clothes. Rank was suspended. No one saluted anyone. The American Red Cross ran the facilities with a staff of nurses and recreation workers. There were horses, and men who had not ridden a horse before the war found themselves doing so. There were trout streams. There were billiards tables and dartboards and unmonitored quantities of Scotch whiskey. There were no briefings, no formation flying, no intelligence officers with acetate overlays of German city centers. No one required a man to think about the war for the duration of his stay. The psychological rationale was direct, and it was stated plainly in the program's founding documents.
A man who had watched his co-pilot's skull come apart over the Ruhr Valley, who had held a 4-engine formation alone for 38 minutes with 2 engines feathered and a dead waste gunner slumped against the fuselage, who had landed at Molesworth with 200 holes in his aircraft and reported to intelligence debriefing still shaking, that man, if given no structured intervention, would deteriorate along one of 2 paths. He would break completely and become a permanent psychiatric casualty, or he would be returned to duty with his fear still unprocessed and his judgment still fractured, fly badly, and die on his next mission.
Both outcomes removed a trained man from the system permanently. The Flak House was designed to create a third path. It worked. Of the approximately 6,000 men processed annually through the convalescent training program, more than 75% returned to combat-capable status. They were not, in the program's own clinical language, fully restored. They were adequately restored to function. And adequate restoration to function was, once again, precisely the metric the Americans were optimizing for. Not perfection. Adequacy. At volume. Pause on that distinction. The Luftwaffe was optimizing for the extraordinary pilot. The Americans were optimizing for the adequate pilot, restored and returned. In a war measured in years rather than campaigns, the second strategy compounds and the first exhausts. Now compare the German parallel. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent program. An exhausted German pilot could, at his Geschwader Commodore's discretion, be sent to a rear area convalescent facility. But there was no systematic rotation, no guaranteed rest period, no structured return to duty pathway. There was no policy. There was only the commanding officer's judgment, exercised against a backdrop of permanent manpower shortage that made every absent pilot a tactical problem for the unit. The arithmetic of scarcity made compassion operationally costly in a way that the arithmetic of abundance did not. Germany could not afford to rest its pilots because the system had never built the pipeline that would make resting them affordable. And then there was the water. The North Sea and the English Channel were, for airmen of both sides, a particular species of death. Cold, gray, unmarked, indifferent to nationality. But the Americans and British had, by 1943, constructed between them a systematic air-sea rescue service that had no coherent equivalent in the Luftwaffe over those waters. The Royal Air Force Air-Sea Rescue Service, supplemented by USAF rescue squadrons flying Grumman OA 10 Catalina amphibious aircraft and coordinating with Royal Navy patrol launches, was extracting between 30 and 40 aircrew per week from the North Sea by late 1943. The men they pulled from the water were back at their bases within 72 hours. Some of them flew their next mission 6 days later. Between January 1944 and May 1945, the combined Allied Air-Sea Rescue Services recovered more than 8,000 aircrew from the waters surrounding the British Isles. 8,000 men who, in the Luftwaffe's accounting system, would have been recorded as killed in action. 8,000 men who, in the American accounting system, were recovered assets, trained, experienced, restored, and available. Many of them became members of an informal organization that captures the Americans' institutional attitude toward survival with almost startling clarity, the Goldfish Club, founded in 1942, and open only to airmen who had been forced to ditch or bail out over open water and been rescued. By the war's end, the Goldfish Club had more than 9,000 members. The Goldfish Club was not a memorial society. It was a reunion of men the system had refused to write off. A German pilot who bailed out over the English Channel in the autumn of 1943 had approximately a 40% probability of recovery by Luftwaffe Seenotdienst assets. An American pilot who entered the same water had a 70% probability of being back at his base within 3 days. The difference was not the water temperature. It was a decision made years before the war that the cost of saving these men, the boats, the aircraft, the organization, the doctrine, the training, was an investment with a recoverable return. The Luftwaffe was counting pilots who survived. The Americans were counting the system that produced, protected, and recovered pilots. Those are not the same count, and in 5 years of industrial war, the gap between them became the war itself. Part 4. The Reckoning. The moment when the Luftwaffe's best minds began to understand what was happening to them came not as a revelation, but as an accumulation, a slow, terrible accretion of evidence that their own doctrinal framework was structurally unable to interpret. Because interpreting it correctly would have required admitting that the war had been lost at the factory level before a single bomb fell on a German city. General Major Adolf Galland reached this understanding first, and most precisely. Galland was, in the assessment of virtually every aviator who faced him across a gun sight, British, American, or German, among the finest fighter commanders of the Second World War. His 104 aerial victories were less impressive than his institutional intelligence. He understood systems, supply chains, replacement pools, and the mathematics of attrition in a way that most warriors, trained to think in terms of individual combat, do not. In January 1944, he submitted a formal memorandum to Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring that summarized the strategic situation with the blunt specificity of a man who had stopped trying to be reassuring. Our experienced pilots are being killed at a rate that our training establishments cannot approach, he wrote. The Americans are replacing their losses. We are not replacing ours. We are losing a quality pilot. They are gaining an adequate pilot. After 12 months of this arithmetic, we will have no pilots. They will have thousands. Göring's response, which Galland documented in his memoir, was to accuse Galland of defeatism and to suggest that the losses were the product of inadequate aggression rather than structural imbalance. Galland was not wrong. He was simply reporting facts that the system's assumptions made politically impossible to act on. Colonel Hannes Trautloft, commanding Jagdgeschwader 54 on the Eastern Front through this same period, reached a parallel conclusion through a different lens. Trautloff was not watching attrition tables. He was watching the men arriving to replace his dead. In his diary, entries from the winter of 1943-44 return repeatedly to the same observation: the new pilots were not pilots. They were passengers who had been placed in fighter aircraft and told to function as pilots. A Rottenflieger, a wingman, with 2 years of combat experience, Trautloff wrote, is worth, in operational terms, 20 men from the latest training cohort. And we are trading the first for the second every day. The quality gap between the men leaving the Luftwaffe and the men arriving to replace them was widening at a rate that no tactical brilliance could compensate for. And then, in January 1944, the Americans introduced a technological escalation that transformed the arithmetic from punishing to terminal. The North American P-51D Mustang, equipped with 3 drop tanks carrying an additional 489 gallons of fuel, could escort heavy bomber formations not merely to the German border, but all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of approximately 1,500 miles. This was not an incremental improvement in escort range. It was the elimination of the concept of an unescorted penetration. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy for the Reich's interior had been predicated on the fact that American fighters could not follow the bombers deep. That fact had ceased to be true. General Jimmy Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944, compounded this advantage with an operational order that remains one of the most consequential tactical decisions of the entire air war. He gathered his fighter group commanders and told them to stop flying close escort, stop orbiting the bombers in defensive circles, go find the Luftwaffe and destroy it over its own airfields, as it was landing, as it was taxiing, wherever German aircraft and German pilots could be found and killed. The P-51s of the 354th Fighter Group, the 357th Fighter Group, and 15 others began appearing over Luftwaffe bases inside Germany, attacking aircraft on the ground, pursuing fighters into their landing approaches, killing pilots as they climbed out of cockpits. The Luftwaffe was being hunted at home by an enemy that was replacing its own losses faster than the hunt could produce them. Galland wrote to Gring again, proposing what he called the Grower Schlag, the big blow, a single, concentrated interception effort in which every available German fighter would be launched simultaneously against one American bomber formation. Aiming to destroy 400 aircraft in a single day and deal the 8th Air Force a loss from which, unlike every previous loss it had absorbed, it genuinely could not recover. The plan had logic. It was approved in theory, delayed in practice, modified beyond coherence, and ultimately never executed, while the training pipeline continued its deficit spiral and the P-51s continued their systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's most experienced men at the precise moment when their experience was most irreplaceable. The bitter irony was that the Germans had already tested this theory, without framing it as a test, on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid. They had, by any objective measure, won that battle. 60 B-17s downed in a single day, hundreds more damaged, nearly 600 men killed or captured. Luftwaffe Reich's intelligence officers filed reports stating that the 8th Air Force could not sustain losses at this rate and would require at least 3 months to recover operational capability. They were projecting the Luftwaffe's own replacement system, the one that required months to produce trained men, onto an enemy whose replacement system operated on an entirely different timescale. The 8th Air Force flew its next major mission 6 days after Black Thursday, on October 20. The Germans' intelligence framework had no category for this. They filed updated reports suggesting the Americans must have held secret aircraft reserves. The truth was simpler, and from the German perspective, far more frightening. There were no secret reserves. There was just the pipeline, running on schedule. For a Luftwaffe commander reading this from the receiving end, there was no tactical answer. The Americans were not winning on tactics. They were winning on the spreadsheet that existed behind the tactics. The one that showed 10,000 new pilots per month entering the pipeline, 6,000 aircrew per year being repaired and returned from the Flak house network, 8,000 men recovered from the North Sea and put back in cockpits, and a tour rotation policy that kept every man in the American system psychologically oriented toward completing his obligation and returning to function, rather than toward dying with dignity in a system that had forgotten to build a way out. Part 5. The Verdict. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched 730 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators against Berlin. It was the first significant American daylight bombing mission against the German capital, and it was devastating, not for Berlin, but for the 8th Air Force itself. 69 aircraft were lost. 692 men were killed, wounded, or captured. It was the highest single-day loss rate the 8th Air Force had recorded in the entire war. 6 days later, 590 bombers went back to Berlin. Pause on that sentence. 6 days later. Not after 3 months of recovery. Not after emergency shipments of replacement aircraft and emergency recalls of crews from rest assignments. 6 days. The 8th Air Force absorbed 69 aircraft and nearly 700 men on a Monday and returned to the same city with 590 aircraft on a Sunday. German Fighter Command, analyzing the order of battle before the Second Berlin mission, concluded that replacement aircraft were arriving from American factories faster than they could be destroyed. That conclusion was correct. What the intelligence summary failed to fully register was that replacement crews, the men, were arriving at the same rate, from the same pipeline, with the same systematic reliability. There was no emergency. There was a system functioning as designed. Between January 1, 1944, and June 6, 1944, 5 months, the 8th Air Force flew 15,892 individual heavy bomber sorties against targets in Germany and German-occupied Europe. In those 5 months, it lost 247 heavy bombers. It also received 1,300 replacement aircraft and more than 13,000 replacement crew members. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force had more operational aircraft and more trained crews available than it had possessed on January 1. The losses had been absorbed. The machine kept running. This was not resilience. It was engineering. Now here is the forensic audit. The Luftwaffe was right about several things, and the record demands that those things be acknowledged fully before the verdict is read. It was right that American pilot training was compressed. The evidence for this is unambiguous. The Army Air Forces lost 15,530 aircraft in training accidents within the continental United States between 1942 and 1945. And 13,854 men died in those accidents. These were not combat losses. They were the byproduct of pushing volume through a compressed training schedule at industrial scale. German pilot training, by the standards of its pre-war design, produced safer and more skilled individual aviators than the accelerated American system. This was true, and the accident statistics prove it. It was right that individual excellence is decisive in aerial combat. Erich Hartmann's 352 victories are not a statistical artifact. A skilled pilot survives longer and kills more than an average pilot. The Luftwaffe's Experten, the aces who carried the weight of the defense of the Reich, on their exhausted shoulders in 1944 were, individually, more dangerous than the average American pilot they faced. This was also true, and dismissing it would be dishonest. What the Luftwaffe was wrong about, structurally, institutionally, fatally wrong about, was the metric it had chosen to optimize for. Germany was measuring air power and pilot quality, kills per sortie, aces per Geschwader, decorations earned, individual distinction accumulated. These are all real measures of a real thing. The United States was measuring air power and system throughput, sorties per day, replacement rates, operational readiness percentages on any given morning, the fraction of trained men who could be returned to duty after damage rather than written off as permanent losses. These are also real measures of a real thing, but they are not the same thing, and in a war of industrial attrition measured in years, rather than campaigns, only one of these measurements predicts the outcome. Here is the philosophical core of what happened in the skies over Germany between 1943 and 1945. When a system is built on scarcity, scarcity becomes its operating assumption, and every decision it makes about training depth, about rotation, about rescue, about rest, about rehabilitation is made under the implied constraint that there is not enough to go around. The Luftwaffe could not build a tour rotation system because it could not afford to lose pilots from the front. It could not build a Flak house network because it could not afford to remove pilots from service. It could not build an adequate air-sea rescue fleet because it could not justify the resource expenditure against the immediate operational demand. Each of these decisions was individually rational within the logic of scarcity. Cumulatively, they ensured that every loss was permanent, that every battle made the next battle harder to fight, and that the air war, however brilliantly conducted on any individual day by men of genuine courage and genuine skill, could only compound toward defeat. An air force built on abundance can afford to be compassionate. The Flak houses were compassion. The 25 mission tour was compassion. The Air-Sea Rescue Service was compassion. The training pipeline that graduated 10,000 pilots a month and then guaranteed each of them a way home was compassion, institutionalized and funded at a scale that no economy running on rationed fuel and aluminum could imagine, let alone replicate. And each of those compassionate investments returned trained men to the fight, compounding the advantage not in one battle, not in one campaign, but across the full 5-year duration of the war. If every share and comment on this video reaches one more person who doesn't know this story, then the men who built that system, who stayed anonymous while the aces got the headlines, become visible for a few more days. They deserve that. It compounded in the form of experienced pilots who survived one tour and, because the system gave them a choice, volunteered for a second. Men like Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group, who completed one combat tour, returned to the United States to train new pilots, and came back to Europe for another tour, because the system allowed it, and because he was not yet done. It compounded in the form of 8,000 men pulled from the North Sea who flew again and briefed their survival experience to new crews, making the next bailout marginally more survivable than the last. It compounded in the form of a Luftwaffe that, by the autumn of 1944, was placing pilots with 100 hours in their logbooks into Bf-109Gs against Americans with 400 hours, not because Germany lacked the courage or the engineering to do better, but because the training pipeline had been progressively starved of fuel, instructors, and organizational priority by the same doctrine that had never believed in pipelines. Every subscription that keeps this channel running keeps the story of the men at Coombe House and Stambridge Earls, the Red Cross workers, who poured whiskey for men who had watched their crews die at altitude, from disappearing into the aggregate footnotes of a war that prefers its heroes individually decorated. The Luftwaffe had the better pilots. The Americans had the better pipeline. And in a 5-year war of industrial attrition, the pipeline does not merely win. It becomes, eventually, the only thing that was ever going to matter.